Hola, muy buenas a todos y bienvenidos a Cosas Militares nuevamente. Hoy tenemos a Michael Kaufman, director del Centro de Análisis Navales de la US Navy y del US Marine Corps. Vamos a intentar tener una charla entretenida y solo una cosa, me lo dijisteis en la entrevista anterior, dadle al donde pone CC y después vais a poder de esta manera ver los subtítulos, le dais a la rueda dentada. Let me present you Mr. Kaufman, and overall, thank you very much for being here with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on your program.
All right, yeah, let's go straight into Kherson to begin with. So what do you think about the Russian retreat? Was just like something inevitable for them, maybe in a few months because of the attrition of the fighting, or this was just a measure in order to say, okay, we are going to secure the whole front, we are going to say bye to Kherson, and that's what we are trying to do. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think the Russian military was on the wrong end of a battle defined by attrition in Kherson. I thought that the main reason they withdrew is they were being pressed out and they could have maintained the position there longer. But the reality is that there were no prospects in staying in Kherson on the right bank of the river. First, the Russian military had no chance of a counteroffensive there, right? So any territory they lost, they were going to essentially be steadily pressed towards the river and towards the main crossing point. Second, they were down to a set of ferries and one main crossing point at Novokakhovka Dam. Third, I think the bigger issue was the need for them to conserve ammunition. They used up too much artillery ammunition over the spring and summer, and they had to consolidate the front and elect a more defensive strategy. This looked to be Surovikin's argument based on anecdotal evidence of what we know was his position. And that's why they withdrew. That said, as you probably know, they withdrew with the bulk of their force intact and their equipment, and they stripped a lot of the equipment they couldn't actually take with them. And it was a pretty organized, cohesive operation, a retrograde operation that looked very different than what happened in Kharkiv or even in Liman. So the bulk of the forces that they had, and they used mobilized personnel that they deployed to cover the retreat, were able to get across the river, and now you see some of them being redeployed to fight at Bakhmut. I will tell you that Kherson of itself is an interesting battle. I won't say that I especially spent a tremendous amount of time there, but I did get to go there in October myself. So I was, let's say, relatively near the front lines. But it was a grinding fight. Okay, Ukraine had basically two stages where they pushed Russian forces pretty hard at the beginning around August 29th, 30th, and then again a month later, beginning of October. But the losses were significant on both sides. And despite everything that's been said about the efficacy of HIMARS strikes, the truth is that after 4 months, the Russian military still could supply artillery to the front and still could withdraw from across the river. So it's a very effective system, but it's also a very valuable lesson for folks who believe in silver bullets in individual technologies rather than the aggregate effect of these capabilities and how forces are able to employ them.
All right. So, generally speaking, we could say, or I think that's your opinion, right? That there wasn't an immediate threat to the logistics of Kherson. It wasn't like, all crossings are getting bombed and all of that. Just that it was a decision in order to reinforce the whole front. That's it.
Well, no, I mean, it was growing. I think Russian military saw the writing on the wall that over time that position was going to become untenable, and there was no point to stay in Kherson because it was just a question of time, right? Ukraine could have kept that offensive going well into the winter and then into the spring. And I think from the Russian point of view, if they were going to withdraw eventually, what was the point, right? Because they could save a lot on frontage space, then fix their force density to territory ratio, and redeploy on other parts of the front. So I think that actually was withdrawing from Kherson was probably one of the smarter things they could have done from a strategy perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what about the quality of the mobilized forces on both armies? Do you think that any of them has a higher quality than the other? Are they more or less equivalent? What do you think on that?
Well, I mean, one of the questions, first question is how would we know, right? So, right, mobilization usually starts off as a pretty chaotic and haphazard process because militaries are not set up to take in such large numbers of personnel. Even when they say they aren't, right?
Yeah.
On the Ukrainian side, they enacted mobilization at the outset of the war. They quickly found that they actually didn't have a lot of the equipment and the weapons that they would need to equip the force. And mobilization was Ukraine's principal strategy for dealing with a large-scale Russian invasion. Mobilization provided the manpower they needed. They created additional units, battalions with them, and they raised their force readiness by a substantial amount. They too were, in practice, a partial mobilization army. It had demonstrable effects several months into the war, right? Mobilized personnel allowed Ukraine to hold the line in the spring and in the summer. Although they too had morale issues, they also had a lot of problems with folks that had very little training that were deployed and that weren't very interoperable with other parts of the force. In general, the unintangibles, I think it's pretty obvious that the Ukrainian military is favored. Okay. But good luck measuring those. You know why we call them intangibles? It's because you can't measure them. If you can measure them, then they would be tangibles, right? So analytically, it's a bit of a self-licking ice cream cone to try to imagine metrics for intangibles. But on the Russian side, mobilization started off quite poorly, but that's because they were not mobilizing in the spring when they still had the force and the personnel to train it and a lot of the equipment, right? And that would have been much more dangerous if they'd done in April. They were mobilizing into the winter when they already spent a lot of the personnel and the equipment they had to equip an additional part of the force, and they weren't deploying them in for an offensive. They were essentially deploying them as a desperate measure to stabilize the line, right? So the first people they threw at the line were just there to try to hold it. But, after now we can say around maybe 2 months or so, or a bit less than that, you can see that it's a phased process, that the initial personnel they deployed did actually help them stabilize the line, that probably they're going to conduct a rotation, that the rest of the units are in training, and maybe about half are in Russia, half are in Ukraine, and it's going to continue on as a phased process. And you won't be able to really judge its effects for probably another 3 months. From my point of view, February is a good time to look to see what Russia can or can't get out of mobilization. People are a bit overly eager to make claims in this space, but for Ukraine, mobilization showed its real effects more towards May, June. And for Russia, I don't think you're going to see enough to have a judgment of mobilization will yield for them until later this winter. On the quality, I think Ukraine overall is better off, and Ukraine has the benefit of having access to different Western training programs, although they're quite small. This program in the UK, it's only for a couple of weeks, and it's fairly anemic in terms of its throughput rate. It's an effort that will scale. But if you think about the size of the Ukrainian military, and if you think about how many additional units they created with mobilized personnel relative to the number of people being trained, it'll take quite a bit of time. What else can I say on this matter?
All right. And what about the industrial part of the mobilization? Do you think that Russian industry can get enough resources in order to increase their artillery ammunition production, to strategic effects? Or do you think that they will have to, to trust in different countries in order to get enough ammunition to deal with such thing?
Well, those are two separate questions. So first, can they get the resources to make, I guess your question is about artillery. I mean, probably their main choke point will be on the chemical side, right? Not on the actual making of artillery shells part. And they've definitely mobilized shifts across the defense sector and gone to double and triple shifts. So they think they have the components, right? You see them making deliveries throughout the course of the year. I don't know the actual state of the industry and the choke points. I'll be very honest. I've seen a bunch of folks try to examine the space, but it's not very easy. Are they going to need to try to get ammunition from countries like North Korea? Yeah, most definitely. Nobody's going to make enough ammunition for their use rate. The Russian military is a fires-based military. It's going to consume ammunition at an incredible rate, even if they try to conserve it. Okay, nobody can make ammunition to sustain a conventional war at this intensity of fighting. It's a problem, by the way, it's a problem on the Western side too. Just to be clear. The Ukrainian consumption of artillery ammunition relative to what is being produced on a monthly basis in the countries that are supplying it is an issue. It's a medium to long-term issue. It's not an issue, let's say, for tomorrow, but it is most definitely a problem. So yeah, the long story short is, no, Russia's not going to be able to produce enough artillery ammunition to sustain the war at this rate. And they're going to have to try to depend on external sources they can get to them, or they're going to have to change things up.
Right. And now that, Ukraine, as they are suffering with all of these attacks on their electricity network and all of that, as they will try to counterattack, let's say, attack inside Russia, attack sometimes their own electric network, all of that kind of things. Do you think that to a certain extent, let's say, sorry, I forget the question. Sorry. Okay, so let's go into military culture, because it was something I was really curious about it. And do you think, in the end, that in comparison to strategy, doctrine, equipment, it is very important? Or what do you think on it? How you evaluate it?
Yeah, I think military culture is very important. Culture often will supersede doctrine at the end of the day. Doctrine can be whatever you like it, and doctrine can be really brilliant theoretically, right? But then when you try to turn it into practice, you find that aspects of your military culture are such that the doctrine doesn't work in practice, right? So, for example, challenges the Russian military has is doctrinally they're fairly rigid tactically, and they put together maneuvers through kind of individual battle drills, and are pieced together. The tactical level formations don't have much of a planning staff, right? So the commander picks the course of action, then they sort out logistics, and they're very heavily data driven. And the challenge in that system is it's a garbage in, garbage out system. If the data's bad, then the planning's very bad, and the maneuvers selected isn't going to work. Okay. What that means in practice is about MDAP, sort of military decision-making process. What that means in practice is that doctrinally it makes sense given the quality of the force they have, because a lot of the thinking is much more when it comes to operational art and higher echelons. But at tactical level, they have big issues because the military culture in Russia is one where people falsify what happened all the time. And so they write that, 100% of the helicopters took off and struck, 70% of targets, but that's not what happened at all. And then commanders are operating on that base, and you can see in this war that, an attack is conducted by a set of units who believe that they are following up an initial offensive, and that offensive had already broken through or degraded defensive lines, but that didn't happen. Basically, everybody reports success when it didn't take place. So it's a system with weak accountability and a lot of falsification. And it has nothing to do with corruption. It has a lot to do with just military culture. So that's one area where you see Russian military culture not meshing well at all with doctrinally how they like to do things, particularly at tactical level. Doctrine is a much more interesting conversation writ large. If you want to get into it, we can get into it. But I actually would say that in some respects, Russia and Ukraine doctrinally are not that dissimilar.
Yeah, that's the other point. How different maybe you don't know this to such extent, but how different is Ukrainian military culture from Russian?
Yeah, I mean that's where a lot of differences probably lie. On military culture, Ukraine's I would say much more of a ground-up decision-making military, where there is preference given to veterancy in decision-making. and it's a much more democratic process in military planning and soliciting views. Also, Ukraine's different in military culture in that they care much more about the force. In the Russian military, you can see officers have a fairly callous approach to how they use troops. Like they have a very sort of early to mid 20th century mentality in how they treat the force and how they deal with personnel. Like they don't care about the individual warfighter, whereas Ukrainians do. You see, the way Ukraine tries to fight is actually focused on force preservation and not throwing away people. I think I saw, from my point of view, anecdotally, I just saw a big difference in accountability on the Ukrainian side, and that's an aspect of culture. It's not something you can easily train. Sorry, anybody who's listening to this on HR who thinks that annual trainings via PowerPoint institute a military culture of accountability. I don't think that's the case. All right, it's the kind of thing that stems from leadership. And by the way, another thing that people think is true but really isn't, is that this big difference is because Ukraine has an NCO corps. Not really. I mean, Ukraine doesn't have a Western-style NCO corps. Actually, how would it have a Western-style NCO corps if like half the military is mobilized? Okay, to begin with, as of since February. Okay, where did all these NCOs come from? You don't see that actually in Ukrainian military so much, right? You see soldiers independent of rank, but with veterancy, right? Take on initiative, take on leadership. And yes, Ukraine has NCOs, but a lot of that is kind of validation and projecting, I think, in Western militaries, because there's a strong desire to believe that Russians are doing poorly because they're not like us, and Ukrainians are doing well because they are like us. But that's not really true. Actually, in terms of force structure and legacy inheritance from the Soviet Union, the Ukrainian military is a lot closer to the Russian military than people think.
Yeah, absolutely agree on that, by the way. Now, I don't want to steal you so much time, so I will ask you just the last question, which is, speaking about the strategic culture, do you think that the Russians really are willing to sustain a high-intensity 2, 3, 4 years war, or they are just trying to, okay, let's stabilize this, maybe launch a small offensive in Donbass, whatever, but let's end the war as soon as possible? What do you think?
So my sense is that this war is going to go on, that the Russian leadership is committed to it. Wars are fundamentally contests of wills, and they have the will to keep it going. Their main problem is that they have a mismatch between military means and political aims. They don't have the military means, and even though they've downsized kind of, I think, minimal war aims, they're still well beyond what the military can actually achieve. I think that if there's any variation on that strategy, it's that Russian leadership at some point would be willing to pursue a ceasefire, but that's only so that they can reconstitute the force and then launch continuation of war. That's one of the likelier trajectory actually of this conflict, is that however it ends, there probably will be a follow-on war if neither side achieves what they think are at least their minimal war aims. Yeah, I think the main challenge on the Russian military side is it has to do with sustainability, material availability, and sustainability, right? Like manpower, quantitatively, they fix to an extent. Qualitatively, they still have big issues. Artillery ammunition is going to be probably the biggest constraint on the Russian military moving forward, and secondarily, equipment. And the political leadership may have the will to continue the war, right? But they're going to consistently be running up against actual material constraints and the fact that the military has fairly consistently underperformed. Although in the last month and a half, you've probably seen to some extent both a revision of Russian strategy and more competent leadership come into effect under Surovikin, and more importantly, a stronger linkage between the military and the political leadership's understanding of what's actually happening in the war. Because previous to that, it seemed clear to me that Putin had very little idea of the reality on the ground, and he was being fed a very rosy picture of where the war was going and Russian prospects for success. And after Kharkiv, it was no longer possible to feed him this information, which, by the way, goes back to the earlier part of our conversation about military culture, right? If if company commanders make things up and battalion commanders make things up, then at the end of that string, there's a chief of general staff in a meeting who is saying things about what's happening in the war and Russian prospects in the war to Putin, and he too is dissembling, right? And you can see how this carries through. Like you can see the coherency of the system and the problem of that military culture.
All right, so that's all. Thank you really much for being with us here today. Sorry because I was a little bit nervous, to be fair, and yeah, that's it. Thank you very much, really.
That's all right. Thanks for having me on your program. Enjoy your weekend, and let's find an opportunity to chat again, maybe at some point down the line.
Oh, I would love to. So, thank you very much y muchísimas gracias a todos por estar ahí. Espero que lo hayáis disfrutado tantísimo como yo. Thank you very much, really. Bye, everyone. Ahí va.